The next item, F, this is the highlight for the day. We're going to talk about June 2nd as Barnstable County Day, and we have Jean from the Tales of Cape Cod. How do I pronounce your last name, Jean? Guill. Jean Guill. You are welcome to join us up at the table here and talk to us a little bit about the history of Barnstable County, particularly June 2nd, 1685.
Do we have the overhead?
Yep, we're going to be getting a PowerPoint up on the screen in one minute.
Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you. I am Jean Guill from Tales of Cape Cod, and we have been in discussion. I guess where this started is we were in discussion with Don Reynolds about the possibility of putting an interpretive marker in front of the courthouse. I live across the street and I see many tourists and visitors wandering around looking, asking questions. And we think it would be appropriate to have an interpretive marker that just provided some of the history about the county and the building.
Can I just stop you right there? We've actually, as a board, we've talked about this, about the importance of the renovations to the building and finding ways to make its history more accessible to the residents of the county and for visitors. And we would love to have maybe a discussion at a future meeting, literally on this topic. So your suggestion is very well received, and we're going to invite you back soon to have even a more detailed conversation about that and other ideas that you might have.
Thank you. That project, I understand, is moving ahead. We will have a mock-up to share with you. And ultimately, my understanding is that your approval is necessary to move forward. So it's not going to go around you in any way. But we are producing the mock-up now. The history of Barnstable County really starts with the history of Plymouth Colony, 1620. By 1627, the Pilgrims had established a trading post of Tuxet, south of Plymouth on the Monomet River. Over the next 10 years, they expanded to the north, south, east, and west, establishing towns. The three towns on Cape Cod to first join Plymouth Colony were Sandwich, Barnstable, and Yarmouth. The next slide, please. By 1685, the population of Plymouth Colony had reached about 10,000. Travel to and from Plymouth for court proceedings was a challenge for many of the more remote towns, and the town leadership, in particular under Thomas Hinckley, Governor Hinckley, who was a Barnstable resident, decided to divide the colony into three counties. And Barnstable County was created on June the 2nd, 1885, along with Plymouth County and Bristol County. There was a lot of discussion about the county seat and debate between Yarmouth and Barnstable as to who would be the county seat or the shire town. In the end, Barnstable won that, and it was probably because of the more central location, and also Governor Hinckley probably pulled out a trump card on that one. Barnstable is named for Barnstable, England, spelled slightly differently, but pronounced about the same. If you're planning to visit Barnstable, England, that's where it is. And you'll probably be very comfortable because it's surrounded by towns like Taunton, Tiverton, Falmouth, Truro, Plymouth, Dartmouth, very familiar names. And people that have been there say that when the tide goes out, it looks very much like Barnstable Harbor. The town of Barnstable was not created around a typical green as most New England towns, or many New England towns are. It took its shape by the path along the Great Marsh, which became Old Kings Highway. The early settlers tended to settle on the north side of the street, carve out property for themselves. The south side of the street was somewhat of a common field, both for agriculture and woodlots. And that existed until 1885. Next slide. By 1639, there had emerged two clusters of communities or houses in the town of Barnstable. The first Old Town, which is roughly where Comaquid is today, and the second Pond Village down around Scudder Lane. I have heard some of the old time Barnstable people talk about before the area where the post office was filled in, the high tides would come right up to Old Kings Highway. So this was not the center of town originally. The town was really on either side, and they built fortified housing. The elders of the town built a fortified house. There are historical markers at each site indicating the general location. These tended to have stone first floors to protect the house so that the settlers could come there in case of an attack by Native Americans or other unfriendly parties. We don't know much more about them than that. The next slide. John Lothrop emerged as the leader of the community. He was the pastor of the Congregational Church. And he chose to locate his house between Pond Village and Old Town, which happened to be directly across the street from us today at the site of Barnstable Tavern. He lived there for 5 years, complained about the construction, and the settlers built him a better house, which is now part of Sturgis Library. And the first floor of that building was large enough to hold church services in there. And that's one of the oldest surviving buildings that was used for religious purposes in the country. Next slide. Access to the harbor was critical in colonial times. This was the major primary means of transportation. There were two paths to the harbor. Scudder Lane, one became Scudder Lane, the other became Rendezvous Lane. What we know as Millway did not develop until much later. So if you consider that the road to the harbor, Rendezvous Lane, is more in the middle of Pond Village and Old Town, it's not surprising that the commercial and administrative center of Barnstable developed very close to that intersection of Rendezvous Lane and Old Kings Highway. Next slide. If you're going to call yourself a county, you need a courthouse. The first courthouse was built in 1685 or 1686. We don't know much about it. Some sources say that it was east of the Crocker Tavern on the south side of Main Street. Some sources say it was west of Crocker Tavern. And some sources say it was on the site of the old colonial courthouse at the intersection of Rendezvous Lane. In any case, it was probably a very modest building, one room, and served the county until 1763. The next slide. At that time, the second courthouse was built at the intersection of Rendezvous Lane and Main Street. And that was one large building, one large room within the building. All court proceedings took place in that room. The jury had to go across the street for deliberation in a tavern. And it was very common to have multiple taverns surrounding the courthouses, both for housing and entertainment, as well as for jury deliberation. So we had about 5 taverns around the old colonial courthouse when it served as that court building. The county records originally were stored in the homes of the county administrators. Sometime before the Revolution, the county house was built, and this was located directly across from the Crocker Tavern. It was a brick building, or had 3 sides that were brick, and it was the depository of all the county records from 1685 to the present at that time. That building burned in 1827. And when it burned, it destroyed practically all of the old records of the counties, deeds, court proceedings, and so forth. Next slide. These are sketches of what the courthouse looked like, the second courthouse at the intersection of Rendezvous Lane and Main Street, and the county house. Both were known as Georgian buildings, British style architecture with a hip roof. The courthouse actually had a cupola and a bell. That bell exists today. It was given back to Sandwich, from whence it came, and it's one of the oldest bells in the nation, dating back to the 1600s.
And where is it today?
Excuse
It's in Sandwich.
It's in Sandwich at the large church on the green or by the water. Barnstable County bought the bell from Sandwich, and it was used in this courthouse. It was transferred to this building when this building was built, and it was used until it cracked. And I don't recall the date of that, but it stayed in this building on display for many years, and then it was given back to Sandwich. It's kind of a shame. It would be nice if it were here
Yes. it
today.
was
Next slide. When the county house burned in 1827, the county administrators knew they needed to build a new building to house the records. There was considerable debate about where that building should be located and what it should be. They also realized that the existing courthouse at that time was too small for the growing community in Barnstable County. The building, as I said, was one room. There was a lot of criticism of having the jurors move across the street to a tavern for deliberation. The building did not have any public seating in it. People had to stand during court proceedings, and it had been allowed to run down. So the period between the end of the War of 1812 and the Civil War was a period of great prosperity for Barnstable County. It was during that time that fishing was still decentralized, so a lot of the fishing was done from harbors like harbors on Cape Cod. Salt was a very prominent industry on the Cape. Agriculture, whaling was booming and provided employment for many Cape Codders, as well as shipping. So it is not surprising that the town officials turned to an eminent architect to design their new building. And the decision was made, one, to put the court proceedings and the court records in one building. Also, they wanted to make it relatively fireproof as possible, given the technology of that time. So the building was constructed out of Quincy granite, and there are the metal doors in the old portion of the building that can be pulled to seal off sections of the building. The architect, we think, based on suggested evidence, was Isaiah Rogers. Someone once said that if you want to be remembered in history, you should not be an architect, because what happened to Isaiah Rogers, many of the buildings that he designed were in urban centers, commercial centers. And as the centers grew, those buildings became dated, too small, they were destroyed and replaced by other buildings. So if you go into a place like New York today, Manhattan, you don't see old buildings. The demand for that real estate has displaced them. Isaiah Rogers designed the Lowell Town Hall, which exists today. He designed Commercial Wharf in Barnstable. He was an architect for a portion of the U.S. Treasury building in Washington. He was the architect for a portion of the Ohio State House in Columbus. The evidence that we have is that he advertised bids for this building, and anyone interested in bidding on the building, contractor to bid on the building, could see the plans in his office and could submit their bids to him. That's the only evidence we have linking him to the building, but that's pretty convincing.
Yes, it is.
The building was described as one of the most elegant courthouses in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts when it was originally built. It has undergone numerous additions on the sides and back since that time, but it still remains an extremely attractive building, and I personally feel like it doesn't get the credit that it deserves. Would end with one quick thought. I moved to Cape Cod about 10 years ago as my permanent home. one of the reasons we chose the Cape, the beautiful natural setting, the climate, the history was very important to us. And one of the things that's so important on Cape Cod, or makes us unique, I think, is that our history is not just in history books. It's part of our lives, it's part of our culture. We live in these old buildings.